Parental rights are under attack from the most unlikely source, and that is the community. I will explain what I mean in a second, but in order to do so, I must take you through two grueling incidences that have happened in very recent times. A parental rights being usurped on the basis of socially popular notions that are then enforced by community majoritarian mandate at the expense of the individual being considered, at the expense of the parents' moral duty in this country, in America, to care for their children to the best of their ability, and also at the expense of the integrity of the government. In Montana, for example, there was a case where two parents, Mr. and Mrs. Krista and Todd Kolstad, this happened very recently, this happened in January of 2024, lost their child to social services because the child reported suicidality, but the child supported suicidality in the context of wanting not to be a woman anymore. The child's name is Jennifer. Jennifer wanted to be called Leo and wanted to transition. So CPS came, Children and Family Services of Montana came, investigated the incident, and insisted that against the demands of Krista and Todd Kolstad, the parents of this child should have to be allowed to transition because it is in their best therapeutic instance. The child was then removed from the home and taken to the hospital because the child allegedly did things to themselves. I'm not going to describe, like drank things to try to kill themselves. In their own words, the hospital found no substances that the child claimed to have drank, which fit with the parents' story that the child had a tendency to make up stories and had a bunch of very troubling mental issues that led up to them wanting to transition. And yet, despite this, Montana Family and Children's Services still decided that transition was the therapy for this child without clearing it, by the way, with psychologists or anything like that. And not only that, decided to ship the child over to Canada, where the child now lives. And the child, instead of being referred to as Jennifer, will be referred to as Leo and will biologically transition as the child wanted to do for a long time. The child, by the way, was 13 when the incident happened. The child is now 14. This happened in America. Another example, which is just quite unfortunate, is that a New York father lost custody of his child, his 8-year-old son, because he wanted his son to stop taking puberty blockers to change gender. An 8-year-old son was taking puberty blockers to change his gender. And the father lost custody. The father, Dennis Hanen, 32, a senior software engineer, as the Daily Mail puts it, has been locked in a nightmare legal battle with his local state Supreme Court, spanning several years, fighting to retain his fundamental parental rights. He claims that the boy, his son's mother, pushed child transition and says the boy himself was not distressed about living as a boy. What's more, the article goes on to say, a year after the court's ruling, the young child Matthew reverted back to his original male gender and is now a regular little boy. But despite this fact, the article goes on to say, the father has lost any say in the medical decisions about his son and sees him for just a few hours every week. He cannot afford to appeal to regain full custody. The article goes on to show a bunch of pictures of the son, so on and so forth. It goes on to say that Mr. Hannon claims it has been a nightmare and it has destroyed my life. And the article also cites the incident in Montana that happened. This man in New York went through all of this around as well this month of February 2024. There are other instances, like a couple in Indiana, that are also trying to fight for custody and fight against the state to keep their children from the clutches of CPS. Many of us may simply think that these incidences are a result of a legal system run amok that has just been tainted by bad cultural motifs and ideas. And while that is partially true, it is true that the culture will eventually reflect itself in the administrative policies of the government, especially when you get to governments that are on state and local levels. It's especially true, more so than it is the federal government, although it's also true on that level as well. But what is not true, and what should be focused on by more Americans, is that the culture does not necessarily, or should not necessarily, change the principles by which our governments operate. Those principles are meant to be inviolable, you can't violate them, universal, they apply to everyone everywhere, and objective. They can be verified by man's use of reason. Our founders understood this, which is why they opted for a Republican, a classical Republican form of government, where the government is controlled by a bunch of different internal checks, and those checks are then enhanced by an aggressive and an energetic public that keeps the government in check when those internal balancing mechanisms, checks and balances, are not able to do so. But the problem becomes when your government is changed structurally and it is remade in the image of a certain social philosophy that preaches a very different message than the message that the government was founded to embody and to protect. You will ultimately you won't just get social influence on government policy, you will get socially birthed government policy. As opposed to policy being birthed from universal principles and sound thinking and a strict set of restraining first principles, they will instead be birthed from the desire and the aim to achieve one's own social agendas pushed forth in the government, so on and so forth. And this is part of the reason, this is the primary reason, why these people are having to fight for their parental rights. See, in any moral society that recognizes the primacy of natural law to the proper functioning of government and to a harmonious social unit, a parent's rights are not just assumed, they are just a prima facie reality. There is no dispute of that unless the parent acts in a way that revokes their ability to have good thinking over their kid. The parent's rights are absolutely 110% absolute. But however, we have moved away from a society based on those rigid set of first principles. And we have moved towards a society that instead is based on a community-centered idea that the government and that society knows what is best for you and your kid. And then the second premise of that horrible, baneful thought is that the government and society have not only the right, but the duty to inflict their vision of your life upon you and your children. This is not just rhetoric. In fact, this is the foundation of the modern child welfare state. This is the foundation of agencies like CPS, Child Protective Services. This is the foundation of the infrastructure that happens to be attacking parents in their inviolable rights to care for their children and shepherd them towards a healthier life. The truth is simple. Progressive era feminists founded what became the modern child welfare state, which was founded on the terrible notion that the community, not the individual, not the private family and the private sphere, because in classical political theory, there's a distinction between the private sphere and the public sphere, governments in public, families in private, not any of that, but the community has the express necessary right to decide what is right for you, your children, and your own personal lives. It collapsed that distinction which kept government resigned to proper functions and enabled it to be a tyrannical force, a busybody force that can therefore make all the assumptions that it wants in your own life. And it has used that single principle to steal children from parents in violation of parental rights, and then promoting child transition to help them with their so-called mental illness. That is the claim that I'm making, and I'll prove it as this video goes on. Let's actually go out through history, because I always exhort people in my videos to study history and study philosophy. Let's go out through history, and I will show you the fruit, the foundations of the modern child welfare state actually come from a progressive philosophy that says that the individual parent and the individual does not matter, but what instead matters is how the whole society feels about a particular thing, how we can make the whole society better, even if that means we're going to violate people's rights in the course of doing it, even if that means we're going to do things that are otherwise not just un-American, but oppose the very philosophy that America was built upon. So, the first agency in the history, not of the country, but of the world, that was explicitly focused on protecting children, ostensibly, of course. I'll explain why they didn't do that in a second, was the United States Children's Bureau, founded in 1912 under the presidency of William Howard Taft, who, along with his other compatriots, was a big progressive thinker and a big progressive era reformer who helped change the structure, face, and nature of American governance from being one of a purely American type base to being one influenced by Prussian and German elements. And the goal of this Children's Bureau was, and I will quote its founding, I will quote, "The Bureau was meant to investigate and report to the Department of Labor upon all matters pertaining to the welfare of children and child life amongst all classes of our people, and shall especially investigate the questions of infant mortality, the birth rate, orphanage, juvenile courts, desertion, dangerous occupations, accidents and diseases of children, employment, legislation affecting children, so on and so forth." So what happened was a desire that was originally the parent's duty, which is child care and child protection, became a concern for the society. Now, it's perfectly reasonable for the society to want to protect children. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I speak out so heavily against gender transition of minors. But when the concerns of the society become the concerns of those in power, you can almost guarantee that those in power will not use those concerns in a pure way to fulfill them and ensure they are answered. Those of power are not motivated by strong values and sound principles. Those of power are motivated by the norms of power. And we all know that the norms of power are such that those in power seek to either perpetuate or increase their hold over power, especially, or even if that means going against the right thing. Whenever you merge virtue with power, you will most certainly get vice, because virtue and power are two different domains that are on two different levels, and if you blend the two, one will obviously override the other. So it went from simply protecting children to compiling all this information and perspective about the various areas of society that children may not even be harmed in, but that the reformers at the time saw as bad. They saw children working as cruel and bad. Even though, in my opinion, if a child is voluntarily working for their parents to do something out in the fields or working, they're getting more in touch with nature. They're cultivating a lot of good virtues. They're perhaps learning some business skills. But what the progressives in the 1900s did is that they painted this horrible picture that child labor was some slave practice. And therefore, because there were some people that were abusing that concept, it should entirely be banned. And they cursed it by association. My friends, proximity ethics is the most dangerous thing to arise in our social strata. We have to be careful to think clearly on the merits of a claim and not bind ourselves to what that claim is close to, and not bind ourselves to the rhetorical fascinations that come up when we look at a certain claim. Because if you do that, you are not looking at something clearly. You have to look at the claim clearly in order to understand it. But it was intentional rhetorical manipulation on the part of the progressive reformers to put things closer to other things, justify policies that under any other metric would have been bad. Like the nationalization of the economy, for example. Anyway, different story, different day. But when you dig deeper, this Children's Bureau was founded, was first headed, was led by a woman who was a part of the maternalist reformers. Now, who were the maternalist reformers? Well, the maternalist reformers were a group of people in the progressive era that believed that the government should act as the partner for a woman when the man was not in the house. See, people will say that the welfare state in the 50s and 60s of LBJ's fame is the reason why a lot of people in America are in a bad state right now. No. The welfare state of the 1912s, 1900s, where this philosophy was baked into our system of government. That's where it started. LBJ just accelerated it up, accelerated the disaster up a little bit. But what it really started was in the 1912s. And it started from a set of premises that we're going to evaluate in a second. So these maternalist reformers believed that women should have a special consideration in public policy. They literally went against the idea of equality in policy to a sort of preferential treatment in policy, which is not really different from the current idea of equity we have today. They believed that, and I'm quoting here from a book that actually examines this movement, a book called Mothers of a New World, Maternalist Politics and the Origins of the Welfare States. The maternalist ideology was summed up in the following quote. The maternalist ideology exalted women's capacities to mother and extended to society as a whole the values of care, nurturance, and morality, and held that the government had an obligation and an interest in protecting and improving the living standards of women and children. The expansionist view of government that the progressives brought forth, which destroyed checks and balances, which destroyed first principles, which made policy not about equality, but about preferential treatment, which emboldened the society of status, which saw people in terms of what class they are in, what position they occupy in institutions, and then embedded value into that through policy. This movement is the prerequisite for the tyranny we see attacking a parent's ability to care for their children in the way they know best. When values no longer become a personal matter of the heart set in the household, but instead a matter for a bureaucrat set in the state house or set in the federal government or set in the Department of Human Services where the CPS lives, then what happens is the government, you no longer are the parent of your children. The government and the community becomes the parent of your children. And the idea that you can use force, that you can use law to perpetuate a care for the community is absolutely paradoxical in almost every single way, because law does nothing but restrict and limit the possibility of something. Law does not enable anyone to do anything by virtue of itself. Yes, law can provide incentives for something, but those incentives come at an opportunity cost, which take from someone or take from something to give to you. So even in the short-term ability of the law to enable an activity, that activity is limited and it is not reliable. And in the short term, as the war on poverty has shown us, it is absolutely ineffective at best, and at worst, it is disastrous. And evidently, the cases of child abuse are not only rising, but they are more prevalent when we consider that the official establishments of our country, the medical establishment, the psychological establishment, all these people, psychiatry, are all lockstep with the idea that transitioning a minor is good for their mental health. So when child abuse, this is good. This is not good, but this is good to recognize. When child abuse becomes, when child abuse is redefined and becomes protected by the society of status under the guise of actually helping the children by dealing with their problems, when in all reality it does the opposite. But if you say that, you're abusing your kid, then what you have is institutions, social institutions, and political power teaming up together to work together to manufacture consent and create a narrative, and then suspend the minds of people in the narrative as if it is the truth. If generations are labored on the idea that not accepting your child's gender identity is child abuse, then eventually they will get further away from the real idea of child abuse, which would be doing this kind of stuff, which would be impugning a child's innocence by introducing them to concepts or practices that are inappropriate for their age and will impact their development, like puberty blockers. And they will have an idea created almost entirely by the forces in power. That's what's happening here, my friends. When you reject philosophy and social progression becomes your ethos in government, as it was for the maternalist movement, which is the foundation of CPS and all these child welfare organizations, you will not be able to truly have a good grasp on what it means to let parents do their own thing, on what it means to protect a child's innocence, and on what it means to allow the family to be the governing unit of their own lives, because your entire axis is switched, and the government and the society are now the governing force of your lives, and they get to decide what is right and what is wrong. We've had a moral and a philosophical perversion of monumentous proportions in this country, but many of us simply want to focus on the short-term rhetorical fascination of gender ideology, when in all reality, gender ideology is not the culprit. It is the asset used by the culprits who are operating according to a community-based framework, which justifies the tyranny of the majority over the parents and the private life of the family in the name of benevolence. We have to stop this, my friends. But we can only stop it if we recognize that progressivism, Prussianism, state-ran welfare, the welfare state, welfarism, all these ideologies have contributed to a place that we are now in our society that deprives agency and dominion from parents over their children, infuses it in the government, infuses it in society on the basis of it being good for the child, and then with impunity harms them with things like approving puberty blockers, which are irreversible until they are later in life and they decide, I didn't want this. At that time, the damage has been done. We must have a society that respects the parents when they are simply trying to act out their values in a manner, of course, which also respects childhood innocence. And these parents in Montana were obviously trying to do that. These the father in New York, who didn't want his 88-year-old kid to transition, was trying to do that. The parents in Indiana were trying to do that. All these people were trying to do that. But philosophy no longer guides our governance. Utilitarianism does, so to speak. Community popularity does. Majoritarian rule does. Welfarism does. And these ideologies are not just bad because they produce bad consequences, not just bad because they disempower the parent. They're bad because they reject one of the most basic principles that organize the possibility of life. That each individual, in his own rational capacity, has not only the ability or the necessity, but the duty to accord himself to the nature of reality, to accord himself to the principles of natural law and justice, and to act out in society under his own rational power those principles to ensure harmony reigns throughout the lands. That is our duty as free individuals. But the moment the community comes in and says, oh no, that duty you have, we're going to usurp it and use it for our own purposes, and your duty is now to obey us, that's the moment the entire structure of society, the family, the individual, free will, everything is upturned. And tyrants now rule us and enslave us in the name of helping us. I don't want to be helped anymore. I don't want parents to be helped anymore. I want parents to be empowered to take care of their children and do what they must to ensure their children have the best lives and their lives are governed according to their values and not the government's values. That's how we must get to a point like that. And we can only get to a point like that if we're willing to confront the enemy, recognize his origins, and fight on that basis. My friends, I love you so much. If you want to keep supporting me, be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Be sure also to share this video, comment on this video, all that good stuff as well. Donate to me if you want to, all in the comment section down below. My friends, I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.